I asked you to ask me questions. And oh boy, you delivered. I tried to sort the questions into blocks that kinda make sense, but I guess we just start somewhere and see how it goes. And contrary to every YouTuber's instinct, I've decided to actually start with what is probably most interesting to most of you. And that is the future of my models as well as this YouTube channel in general. But before we fully get to that, we will start with a rather serious question. A question for which I'm very thankful for. And it will all make sense soon. What do you think about the problem of not accepting other countries in railway circles? They then continue with examples like making English videos on German models. Oh, that rings a bell. Or collecting British models in Germany and getting ridiculed for that. And then they continue, I just want to know your thoughts on the matter, what could be the cause, and what you would do about it. I've seen that happen a lot, especially on the internet. Really, it makes me quite sad. Especially since we railway nerds are already kinda a peculiar group in society, at least we are seen like that. So why would we split ourselves into multiple groups and make fun of a certain group? It just doesn't make sense. However, I kinda understand why that dynamic exists in the first place. Due to the way railways evolved, are there certain railway worlds that are very separated from each other? Of course, American railroads are very different from European ones. But while the continental European railways are somehow connected, are the British ones very isolated. Of course, there are on one hand technical reasons, like the loading gauge is much smaller, but then of course had also Great Britain, as the birthplace of the modern railway, its own large railway industry, constantly rivaling with continental Europe, in particular Germany, but also other countries. And that of course is fully mirrored on the model railway market. So when you look in a German model railway catalog, you will also find Austrian prototypes, Swiss prototypes, some French prototypes, but most of the time not British ones. Now because of the different scales, because of the different loading gauges in real life, and of course both of them are connected, but that ultimately leads to a state of foreignness. A German railway modeler is at least aware of French railways, some of the most important locomotives, and after all, the railways in many of the bordering countries to Germany, they are spiritually not too different, while the British railways are a totally different thing. And if you're not really familiar with British railways, its history and how it works, but you come from a continental standpoint or even more an American standpoint, it would be very easy to say, well, these small locomotives, they are so simple looking, so old-fashioned for their time. Surely they must be much inferior than ours. At least that is kind of the energy I get from many German railway enthusiasts who have absolutely no idea about British railway history, but a very strong opinion on them. Of course, the more you learn about them, not only will you start to appreciate it, the more you will learn that maybe the British railways weren't that bad after all, and unpopular opinion, the teeny tiny bit of speed difference between the Mallet and the German class of 5 is absolutely not important. What is important is that the London North Eastern Railway A4 class was just the all-round better and more practical machine. But I digress. To make that short, where comes this hostile energy from? It's simply due to people not being familiar with something. So many people in online forums, especially when it's about collecting model trains or cars, they're very much fixated on what they know from their own childhood. And we all are that to some degree. Of course, that is completely normal. However, while some people are very much willing to look beyond what they know, are some people unfortunately not willing to do that. They're very much focused on how I think now that's the only way that things are correct, everything else must be wrong or inferior. It's something that really, that can make me furious. Of course, it's only just some people, but enough to really poison some online forums. Especially German online forums are often not a nice place to be. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. And what can one do about that? Well, it's like so often when you meet intolerance and hostility. Education. Those people need to learn. You cannot be rude about British Railways if you know them, if you know their history, because then you have to appreciate them. And that of course leads me somehow to my channel, as even though the other way around, I'm doing exactly that. Educating an English-speaking audience about German railway history. So hopefully breaking somewhat down that border that exists between continental European, not so much between Eastern and Western railways actually, but continental European, British, American and Asian railways, but rather show people from other places that there's so much more outside there. Of course, now we need to make content about international trains for Germans. Well, I'm not gonna do German videos, that's not going to happen. However, and that brings me to the future of my channel, I know that a large portion of my audience, I think it's about 20%, are German, which is not a big surprise. Even though my focus so far has been German models, and will probably always stay that, I very much want to expand beyond German trains. Which is a question that has been asked a lot, if I'm going to do that. And now a fun fact, which you might not want to believe me, but it's actually true. The language of this channel was very much chosen on purpose. However, that my main focus is on German prototypes. That is a bit of a coincidence. That might come as a shock to you, as I am a German, so it just makes sense that I talk about German prototypes. However, it really boils down to what I was most interested in when I started to learn Blender. Had I started to learn Blender a year prior to that, this channel would probably be about British railways. For many years I was more focused on British railways than German ones. But when you start modeling, then you cannot jump around quite as much, so for now I'm focusing on Germany, but other countries will certainly follow. When? That is a good question, because that takes time. As I think I probably explained in my last Q&A video, I don't just want to make individual locomotives or wagons, I want to build small sets of models that belong together. Because after all, my videos are not supposed to be gimmicky. I'm not the kind of channel who just picks out a certain anomaly and talks about it without giving you any context. I'm way more here to talk about the workhorses. You know, the locomotives that were built in huge quantities and that seem so ordinary, but yet are the true heroes of railway history. And with that, I also plan to go beyond railway stuff. The next question. I've made a video about some trucks, and you have seen in the background of my videos here and there that I have cars and trucks. They will probably never be in the spotlight of this channel, but I will do a lot of them. And especially as we move forward in time of models, the percentage of road vehicles will increase, unfortunately. And I even plan to sprinkle in some smaller air or watercrafts eventually. If I will do necessarily videos on them, that's a completely different topic. I guess that depends. If I feel like it's worth doing so. Because the issue is, if you have a railway channel and you make a video about helicopters, the YouTube algorithm just doesn't know what to do with it. I've seen that with my video on the Magirus trucks. Of course, granted, it wasn't my usual history video, but really just a model showcase. But still, the performance of that video was bad, and I'm not surprised by it. I didn't expect it to be very successful. And yes, the next question, do you plan to make models of more recent time? My idea to let you in on my grand scheme. Because everything I do in terms of modeling, I'm not just starting with a new model on a new day just because I feel like it. I do have a big master plan. That master plan changes constantly, absolutely constantly, but there is a very fixed direction I want to go in. So far, this channel has been focusing mainly on the 1960s in Western Germany. And that is kinda the point zero, the starting point, which I will continue to focus on for a while. There will be here and there lookbacks into older times. Of course, the Royal Train is one of them, but these will be sporadic, every here and then and all over the place. But from the 1960s, I will incrementally move forward in time. And that allows me to really trace the stories and histories of not just railway vehicles, but also trucks and cars, and trace the developments. That unfortunately means, on the other hand, that until we arrive at the current day, it will take me years to get there. Because obviously I also don't want to rush it. I want to give everything its time, so that we can do at least the most important prototypes the first time we go through those years. Of course, we can always go back later on. But yes, so modern stuff, eventually yes, but it'll take time. And the reason we have been stuck to the 1960s for now pretty much 2 years, or 4 years, 5 years? I think 5 years if you've already been following me since my Instagram days. Write a comment now if you know me from the time and you're still watching. Then you are a true hero. The reason brings me to the next question. Do you make your designs with physical models in mind? And if yes, what scale? This grand scheme and master plan I've told you about, I can't really kick it off until I started 3D printing my models. And yes, I definitely want to do that. And there have been many questions related to that. One of them is, how far along are you with making your models printable, and will you ever make them available? Truth be told, I still have yet to get a 3D printer. But this is going to happen this year. You will definitely not see any results this year from 3D printing. I might give my channel members a sneak peek on some work in progress prints, but don't expect anything too grand this year. Because of course, I will just have to test a lot. But then hopefully next year, I can go big with 3D printing and building my own models. Because from the start, that always has been the goal. Of course, with Blender, it's pretty quick to render your models and even make some animations, but that always has been just a side product, an intermediate step. The scale I have in mind is 1:50, which is a beautiful scale in that sense that it is not a common model railway scale. So I cannot cheap out and say I use existing track, but I have to do everything myself, which is what I wanted to do for artistic reasons, because everything should be consistent, stylistically speaking. It is a scale very easy to work with, as dividing by 50 is, you can do that in your head. Initially I wanted to create my models in 1:64 scale. Yeah, good luck with doing that in your head. That doesn't work, but 1:50 does. Of course, at least as the models you're creating are metric. For the pannier tank, for example, I have a text file where I have all the most important measurements converted into metric and then divided by 50, and then you of course have a horrible number because, 3 feet doesn't equal 1 meter or 90 centimeters, but something absolutely horrible. So I have to decide which way around, because I won't have measurements like 1.135 millimeters on my models. That's not going to happen, because there's some part of my sanity I want to keep. And also 1:50 is in my opinion the perfect scale, as it's large enough to have work indoors on a goods wagon, for example, that the models are large enough so you can easily handle them and pose them in very different ways. My experience with HO scale is that can get very finicky. Not so much with running model trains, but if you have a crane, for example, try to build up a crane in 1:87 scale. Trust me, once you've built it and put in a location where it looks good, you never want to touch it again, because you're just scared anything would snap or break or damage. But 1:50 scale gives you so much more room. And yet it is still small enough so that even a big locomotive can be easily handled. Ever tried to haul around a Class 01 in O gauge? That is a nightmare. But at 1:50 scale, that is just about doable. And yes, I want to make my models available once they are finished and proven designs. How exactly I'm going to do that is something I still have to figure out, but the focus now is really to get 3D printing and get the first files all polished up, because I feel not comfortable in giving you something half-cooked. That's just not what I want to do. And for some reason in this blog is also that question which came about a lot, and I think I remember why I put it here, is do you have a model railway, and what scale is that? I don't have a model railway layout in that sense, but of course I have model trains. Most of my stuff is HO and OO, which brings me to, I guess, one of the reasons why I put that here, because honestly at some point I was just fed up that continental models and British models don't go along with each other because of the different scale. One of the many reasons I started creating my own models. And I also have a little bit of G-scale, because in my opinion LGB is the best model railway out there ever, period. Especially the early days. But I don't have a lot in G-scale, and also there is no garden to come with it. So it's really more your traditional Christmas train layout, and with it a few small locomotives. But then I have odd things here and there. I have a little bit of narrow gauge. I even have one N-gauge locomotive, which just happened to be there. Because my interest in railways is very broad, or in transportation history general. Because I would even say my main focus on my collection aren't even trains. It's rather road vehicles, model cars. Mostly vintage model cars. But the issue you have when you put model cars and model trains together, even if they're in the same scale, in HO you can easily do that, you see that the tradition behind them is very different. An HO model car is stylistically very different than any trains you can get. And that annoyed me. That annoys me to this day. Then you have the different scales. Then you have the fact that even in HO scale, a lot of things are just not available. And then you have the fact that road vehicles in HO scale are very finicky, and that is the reason why I started creating those models. So I could have everything with the same handwriting. Everything stylistically coherent. Which of course is quite challenging sometimes, as creating a model you have the bias to stick in the tradition of model railways or model cars. To continue those stylistic differences. So I really have to transcend behind it and understand, which unfortunately I know I digress now horribly, bear with me, that creating models isn't just a craftsmanship, it's an art. There is no point in just scaling something perfectly down, it just does not work. And while in drawing and painting we all accept that there are different styles, and there isn't the perfect one, of course. There is a place for cartoon and there's a place for realism, but there it very much is accepted that a painting, it doesn't matter how realistic it looks, will never be a perfect replication of the real world. Even a photograph isn't supposed to be a perfect replication. But for some reason in model making we kinda ignore that completely, and the only thing that matters is if the number of rivets is correct. A philosophy that unfortunately also many model railway manufacturers these days follow. This wasn't always the case, but that leads in a completely different direction. To the next question. What is the video you would like to do if you had unlimited time, money, and tools? I had to think about that for a moment, but then it struck me. There is one idea I had in my head a long time. I think there is one thing that makes the, let's call it story, of German railways very unique. And that is that it cannot be told as an heroic story. The German railways were involved, if not even the backbone of both world wars. And not only that connection, those wars of course have also shaped the German railways. They of course have shaped also many other railways. But the implications the wars had on German railway history, of course, much bigger. You cannot tell the German railway history without the wars. And that gives it all, I don't know if the word is bittersweet is right here, but a very heavy feeling, but something that would make for a beautiful kind of movie type-esque thing. Now, the idea I had is to have a cinematic video which tells, without words really, just in pictures and sequences, the story of German railways, with all its good times, bad times and ugly times, combined with the right special effects, visuals, music, ideally even custom music. I mean, if it's the ultimate video, of course custom-made music. That could be a banger of a video. However, I neither have the models, nor the time, or abilities to make that just yet. But one day, hopefully, I will be able to do that. Because that has been a dream of mine for a long time. Which kinda leads me to the next question. In reference to my video End of Steam, A Bittersweet Goodbye, are you considering video genres like this one? I loved making that video. It took a lot of time and a lot of struggle and a lot of pain and a lot of sweat. And sleepless nights. Because my computer is in my bedroom. And with that running overnight, I don't tend to sleep very well, as you probably can imagine if you have a rattle machine inside your bedroom. But as you've probably already took note of, I'm not creating models for my videos, it's rather the other way around. I'm creating those videos so I have a way to show off my models. But the priority were always the models, an artistic thing, so to speak. As such, I don't really see myself as an educator on German railways, even though de facto I am, but more as a railway artist. And in that sense, a video like End of Steam much more fits what I'm going for with my models than my educational videos. Don't be alarmed, I'm not planning to giving the later one up. Absolutely no. I love making them. However, I certainly want to explore more in the artistic storytelling direction, and there are some ideas of maybe combining both, of having educational videos with more cinematic sequences inside them, or maybe cinematic videos which have some educational elements inside them. So expect to see more in that direction. Oh yeah, and that already answers the next question. What's the direction you want to take the channel to? There will be more cinematic stuff in the future. Certainly. And when I say cinematic, hopefully eventually with physical models. We'll see. But also in context of the cinematic video. Somebody asked as if my grand plan involves modeling the environment more in the future, akin to a digital model railway. Of course, I want to get away from the digital aspect as a whole. But yes, I certainly want to do more in terms of environment and infrastructure, in terms of building. However, I will probably never really build a layout in the traditional sense. I mean, the general reason I'm not too interested in a layout, there are two reasons really. One is that it's very limiting, because either you have a very boring generic layout, or you have a very specific layout. And the other reason is that even though layouts can be very beautiful, they also have the tendency to distract from the models themselves. Therefore, my current idea is how I will treat environment is that also going forwards in videos, you will always see just aisles of cityscapes, of landscape, just small focus spaces, so that the main focus is still on the models themselves. However, that is just an idea. I have to see how that works out. But I will 3D print also buildings, as well as a whole range of other things that I might need. But we have to discover that together as we go along. Okay, now I've talked for 45 minutes about the future of my channel. You can now compare with how far we are into the video, and that tells you of how much I cut out. Now we get to the second block, which is still, I think, very interesting to many of you. And that is about my modeling process. Any tips for someone who wants to model their own trains, real or otherwise? That, of course, is a very broad question, and I can't give you a specific answer to that, obviously. But I guess the most important thing about modeling trains is to, one, be patient, and second, believe in yourself that you can do it. There is nothing particularly difficult about modeling trains. But there's a lot of things that are very tedious. Therefore, you have to divide it up into multiple steps. Rather than saying, today I will create a steam locomotive, because that will never happen, you should say, today I will create a cylinder. Today I will create the boiler. Go step by step. That's the only way you can tackle it. Because otherwise you will just get overwhelmed and burned out before you even have anything that's worth showing off. I had to learn that the hard way, and I have to learn it over and over again because I still don't follow my own advice. Be patient, divide it up into many small steps that are approachable, and trust the process and believe in yourself. Because for the longest time, your model will look like crap. It's just what it is. You put hours into it and it still looks like crap. But eventually comes the point, which always takes me by surprise. It feels almost a little bit like magic, where suddenly the model starts looking good. And then you continue to work, and then eventually it starts to look really good. And if you then keep pushing, eventually you can't even believe you did that yourself. How long does it take you to make a model? A long time. I mean, I can't really give you a definite answer to that, as it really depends. There are models I have created just for the sake of a certain video. And those are not my better models. You know, creating a model that looks acceptable is a fairly quick process. I guess I can create a simple electric locomotive in about 2 workdays, 16 hours. If I really want to rush it and I have already something similar, 8 hours. No problem. A steam locomotive, if I have to recreate it from scratch, 5 days. So 40 hours maybe. If it's a standard class, then maybe I can even push it down to 3 days, as I already have standard classes. But getting a model really ready so I'm happy with it and I can proceed to 3D printing, at least double the time, maybe even triple it. But if you have a mid-sized locomotive and you go from scratch to a finished model, to a really finished, polished model, then that's a month of full-time work. And one thing that speeds up the process a lot, and that leads me to the next question, are the right references. What references do you use and where do you obtain them from? Well, the most important things are photographs. Good photographs. And yes, they are more important than drawings. Because drawings can be incorrect, they often are, and what a drawing does not show you is the overall impression a locomotive has. The overall spirit you need to capture. Photographs do show that. However, having good drawings is very helpful. Not necessarily a must, but if you don't have a good drawing, just some overall measurements, then the process will be very painful. A good example are my Magirostoids round bonnets, because I don't have proper drawings for them. I just have those overview drawings that are in the user's manual. These drawings are notoriously incorrect and very sloppy and very rough. And I just realized that the shape of the hood was off. It just looked wrong. It looked quite awful, to be honest. But I compared with the drawing. It was perfectly accurate to the drawing. Then I looked at photographs and, well, I realized that the shape on the drawing is just absolutely horrible. So I corrected it according to the photographs, because I don't have any better drawings. Eventually, it started to look like the photographs. And now if I look at my Magirostoids round bonnets by Viking, models that I used to like a lot, I can't really look at them anymore because I see that horribly misshaped bonnet, which tells me that Viking also had no better drawings than this awful overview drawing that I work with. And yes, where do I obtain them from? With road vehicles, that's horrible. Fortunately, with railways, that's a whole lot easier. Most of them I get from printed literature. Of course, in the context of German railways, unfortunately, all of these books are only available in German, but, you know, for drawings that doesn't really matter. There, for example, is a series of German locomotive classes by the Eisenbahnkurier. All of these books contain a huge amount of proper, detailed works drawings. These maybe aren't too ideal if you're just starting out to 3D model, as they can be very overwhelming as they show literally everything. But if you want to get a very accurate model, then that is a good starting point. Even though these books are fairly hefty, $50 is the usual go-to price for one of these books, the drawings alone are worth that money. If you compare that, for example, with what you usually pay if you just buy a digital copy of a drawing, these books are extremely cheap. And of course you don't buy them for the drawings. There are also many good and rare photographs. But you also don't really buy them for the photographs. The most work put into them is the research, the text. Of course only available in German, but these books are awesome. For goods wagons there's a series by Stefan Carstens, which is, I think there are by now 10 volumes, which goes through the history of German goods wagons. And those books include custom-made drawings of, at least of all the more important goods wagon types. Of the most important ones, even multiple drawings showing off the same wagon and over time, you know, how it was modified. The wonderful thing about these drawings is that if you're just trying to make a model, especially a smaller scale model, these drawings show everything you need without being overwhelming. And because they are made after the prototypes and not the other way around, usually prototypes are built after drawings, those drawings are perfectly accurate. They show how those wagons actually looked like. Works drawings don't necessarily do that. And otherwise you just have to keep your eyes open. you can often find in second-hand bookshops or online, small publications by railway companies themselves, which often include drawings, and thankfully many of these publications you can get for a very small penny. So I've collected up over the years more drawings than I will be able to model in my entire life. Of course, I still never have the particular one that I need right now, but that is just how these things work. But you just have to keep your eyes open and part with a little bit of cash. You can, of course, also find some drawings online, just with a Google search, but what you will find is very limited. It is enough, however, to get you started into 3D modeling. And we already kinda touched and kinda not touched on the next question. What are the best books on German locomotives in English? And that is a question that I have to pass onwards to you, my audience, because I have no clue. As a German speaker, there is really no reason for me to read English books on German railways for obvious reasons. I know of one book by the Pen and Sword publisher which deals with the German Pacific locomotives, but I haven't read that for obvious reasons, so I'm not sure if I can recommend that book. But there certainly have been some good books in the portfolio lineup about British locomotives, which I have read, so take that maybe as a starting point. My voice already gets sore, we're not even halfway through. But I like the next question. What interfaces do you use to make your creations? And I'm actually very boring in that aspect, as it's just a mouse and a keyboard. I have a drawing tablet, so I could use it, but for hard surface modeling, and that is what I'm doing, creating trains, I don't find a drawing tablet really useful. So mouse and keyboard it is. And the next two questions I want to answer together by not answering really one of them. What's your process for making these models? And can you make a tutorial on how you make your models? The first one I cannot answer in this context, because then this video will end up being several hours long. However, I can and will do a tutorial. I had planned that for a very long time, so expect to see a tutorial series, as one video will not be enough for that, sometime later this year. Okay, let's just continue, and if my voice gives in, then that's that. Because all the following questions will be a lot shorter and simpler to answer, right? What's your favorite streamlined train? That has to be the Santa Fe Super Chief. First of all, the red war bonnet design on the F7s. Beautiful. You know, especially that consist. Is it the 1951 consist I'm referring to? Wait, let me look that up real quick. Yes, it's the 1951 consist I'm referring to, which had the Pleasure Dome car and still the observation car at the rear. All those different cars with different luxuries. It's just a very diverse and a very beautiful train. And of course one that almost from the East Coast, not quite, the Super Chief started in Chicago, gets you all the way to the West Coast to LA. What more could you wish for? And I have the dream of someday following the footprints left by the Super Chief by traveling with the Southwest Chief. Of course, I will probably be disappointed, because there's a reason it's not called the Super Chief anymore and was for some time called the Southwest Limited after Amtrak took it out and all that nonsense. Probably should do a video about that. Southern Pacific Daylight is probably number 2. And what is your favorite American locomotive? I kinda already answered that. It's not the F7 units, even though I love them a lot, but it's rather the Southern Pacific GS4. Or the GS family built by Lemur in general, because, you know, from GS1 to GS5, they're all not that different, at least overall speaking. The devil's in the detail as usual. What's your favorite non-German locomotive? And honestly, I don't really know, because it's very difficult for me to compare. How would I compare an American steam locomotive with a Swiss meter gauge locomotive? I guess Stroudley's Terriers it will be. Those beautiful Brighton machines. Yeah, I guess that's a good favorite. And now we have two questions which made me smile. What would you say is the ugliest engine in German history? And related to that, the answer will be the same. Is there a locomotive class that you have an unnatural disdain or hatred for? When I read about ugliest, I was thinking initially the class 42, because that is really an ugly locomotive. However, I don't really have a disdain for it, because it's ugly in a way that makes it interesting. I'm very much looking forward to one day creating a model of it. But one class that really gives me the ick even thinking about modeling it is a Prussian T10. And yes, that is a tank locomotive, not a tender locomotive without its tender. A tank locomotive that was intended to run backwards as fast as forwards. This locomotive was derived from the Prussian P8, so it was intended to pull light express trains. Backwards. Maybe this answers a bit of a cheat to the second question, as the question was for an unnatural disdain, and I guess my disdain for this locomotive is not unnatural and very much shared by the crews who had to work with that bunker first, because they always felt like they would not be able to see their family ever again, stepping their foot onto that footplate. I mean, just look at it. It looks hideous. And it ran like that too. At least backwards. Forwards it was fine. But backwards, ay. Okay. It is rare that I have such a strong negative opinion about a locomotive, as even the Class 42, which I think is absolutely ugly, I still have some kind of a sweet spot for it, but not for the T10. No. Which experimental German locomotive do you find most interesting? I guess it has to be the steam motor locomotive 19.10, because unlike many other experimental locomotives, this one has proven to be practical and would have opened a whole new world for steam traction. Of course, it's easy to say that the war came in between, and it did. If it had been so useful long-term is debatable. It surely always had only been an intermediate solution, as electric traction already at that point was very much at the forefront in Germany. However, it is a very fascinating concept which shows what would be possible with steam traction and opens so much room for imagining what locomotives we could have seen. Who is your favorite locomotive builder? And what is your favorite locomotive from said builder? Just by that question, I'm pretty sure that you're an American, right? Even though you wrote favorite with an U. So maybe Canadian. Yes, you're probably a Canadian. Let me know if I'm totally off or not. The reason why I'm saying this is, especially in Germany, we don't really think about locomotive builders in that sense, at least outside of industrial locomotives. The reason for that is that state railway locomotives were usually built by many manufacturers. So really, I think more in the way of railway companies. However, if I had to choose a manufacturer which is, I kind of have the most, I don't want to say personal because I don't have a personal per se connection to it, but I feel the most attached to it, then that is Ohrenstein and Koppel. And that comes from two directions. My favorite locomotive of them are, of course, those quaint little 040 field railway locomotives, which isn't a particular class, but a bunch of locomotives that roughly all look the same, but are still very different. This is one way why I love Ohrenstein and Koppel so much, as they were pretty much the Feldbahn manufacturer in Germany. That is the pre-war era, but also post-war, because I'm a big fan of their construction equipment, which in that red and white color scheme just looks stunning, and also, I don't know, I just find them aesthetically pleasing. So, Ohrenstein and Koppel it is. What's your favorite valve gear? That is a question I didn't see coming. And that is also a question I never thought about. It's probably the Stevenson's valve gear. It just has a lot of character. Let's phrase it that way. But it's horrible to rig in Blender. What's your favorite standard gauge industrial locomotive? Talking about specific questions. It's probably one of the Elner types. Now, which one am I going to choose? Which era do you like the most and why? I guess my favorite era would be in the traditional German model railway eras, the era 4, which is computer numbers, so 1968, 1970, until, yeah, when does it end? Unification, formation of the Deutsche Bahn AG, somewhere around 1990. Some model railway manufacturers put it even earlier when the new paint schemes were introduced. It's a mess. But the 70s and 80s are it's just a time period I hold dear to me. And it's not because it was my childhood. I'm not that old. When it comes to transportation history and when it comes to model railway, it's just a beautiful time span. I love the boxy aesthetics, that the trucks at that era were just glorified boxes, and I love it. So were the trains. They had all a very kind of a simple appearance, a very clear lines, a very clear shape, not as not as convoluted as many of the later designs were, but also not those very ornament shapes earlier ones had. It's just the peak of industrial design that looks industrial. And it also was, by every sense of the word, was also the peak of the model railway and model car market. It was before the split between collector's items and toys was really made. So model railway manufacturers were still speaking to a large audience, mainly towards kids, but models had already progressed to a very high standard at that point, while still being affordable and still being designed in a reasonable manner, where there was still a lot of focus on what makes a certain model so special rather than just trying to fill that niche that has been left open. It was also a very colorful period, especially the 70s. I'm fully aware that the ivory ocean blue was by many rail fans back then not liked, to say it politely, but I love it because it's still has still kind of muted colors. So it still feels very classy and classic, while already being much more colorful and much more modern. What is, however, clear cut is what my favorite video is that I've made so far. And that would be about the Diesel of Death, or the V51 and V52. Not only do I love them and are they my favorite German narrow gauge locomotive, here I was really able to kind of fully fulfill what is the intention of many of my videos. To take a locomotive that looks quite ordinary on first sight, that most people wouldn't really have a second thought about it, wouldn't really care. It's just a stinky diesel. But take that ordinary locomotive and tell a very impactful story. It really goes to show how much often lies beneath things that look so simple and plain on first sight. It is, of course, a very special locomotive in terms of German narrow gauge history, and I think just that video worked out perfectly. And now we have the block on opinionated questions. Not about favorites, but opinions. What's your opinion on Swedish steam locomotives? I have to be honest, I don't know a lot about them. However, they are very elegant. And one day, I will at least create one Swedish steam locomotive, hopefully multiple. However, my start with Swedish locomotives will probably be through electric locomotives. What are your thoughts on Shay locomotives? I love them. I absolutely adore them. A Shay has kind of everything what I'm looking for when choosing a new model. It has, I'm talking about them as they all would be the same, which of course is not true, but let's just group them together. They have a lot of character and they're also very unique, and I will certainly do a Shay eventually, and there's a good chance, don't nail me to that, but there's a good chance that my first American narrow gauge locomotive, if we ignore the Porter field railway locomotive I made a couple of years ago, will be probably a Shay. I even have pinpoint, I guess, 2 or 3 different Shays from which I have yet to pick the one I'm going to choose. However, that will happen alongside other American locomotives, and it's not gonna happen anytime soon, unfortunately. The next question is a kind of long one, and one that will lead me to derail a little bit and go off. So bear with me. What's your opinion on some of the experimental pre-war Reichsbahn high-speed steam engines? Class 05, 06 and 19.10. Do you think that hadn't the war gotten in the way, they would have had a shot at Mallet's speed record? I mean, I've already mentioned the 19.10 before. I already mentioned the 05 and Mallet before. Maybe let's start what I think about them. Why haven't I made a model of the Class 05? I will do someday, but I don't feel any urgency. The reason behind is that the Class 05 was just never needed or even wanted. It's a product of a lot of lobbyism by the steam industry. There was never a proper use for the Class 05, so it was never intended for them to go into serial production. Of course, they were the ideal test subjects and also useful for propaganda, but I would not call the Class 05 a successful locomotive. The Class 06, on the other hand, is probably Germany's most misunderstood locomotive, because the 06 was never intended to be a record breaker. In fact, its intention was to do the Class 01's job on hilly terrain, because the simple 2-cylinder machine was chosen in favor of the 4-cylinder compound machine that would have been the Class 02, or that was the Class 02. Had Germany a perfect express locomotive for flat terrain. But the 01 greatly suffered with inclines, and that is what the Class 06 was intended to remedy. Was there really a big field for it, considering that electrification was especially strong on hilly routes? Probably not, but there was a midterm need for that locomotive. And yes, I know there were problems with the boiler design because railway people, especially Wagner, are stubborn. That's what it is. And it derailed a lot. Even though blaming that on the locomotive, that it derailed on Prussian points that were laid down at a time where it wasn't even dreamed about locomotives of the size of the Class 06, is a little bit like running your tricks model of the big boy through toy model curves and complain that it derails. It's not the locomotive's fault. It's just that it's not made for that kind of track. And I'm pretty certain that the Class 06, if the war didn't happen and it had a fair shot, had a fair chance of getting reworked, it could have become a very successful locomotive in its niche. Nobody says the Class 103 is a failure because it literally tore down overhead wires. Or the E10 because of the boogie cracks. We don't speak about that because the polished gemstone turned out to be a jewel. The 06 just always remained rough. 19.10, same story. It could have become a very successful locomotive. Maybe not the Class 19.10 itself. There's a reason it was given that odd number, as it was an experimental locomotive, but it could have led to great things. At least for a short time, until electric traction and diesel locomotives took over for good. And yes, they would make for interesting video subjects, but the issue is I would need the model of them first. And none of them, 05, 06 or 19.10, are happening anytime soon. They will happen eventually. I want to have models of all of them, but all of them doesn't mean right now. I plan to continue this YouTube channel for decades, if YouTube is still around then. What are your thoughts on the Bahnreform? Well, I just keep that short, because otherwise some people would tear apart me in the comments and I will probably tear apart myself. I think, you know, the Bahnreform of 1994, which reorganized Germany's railways. Something had to happen. So in a way the Bahnreform was inevitable. Changes needed to be made. No doubt about that. How those changes were made, however. I mean, truth be told, I'm looking from it from the perspective of the railways, from transportation history and as a railway enthusiast, not so much from an economical or political perspective. I also don't know too much about it from those two perspectives. But from an operational aspect, was it not a good reform? I mean, already splitting up local trains from long-distance passenger and goods trains is less than ideal, as things like using a passenger locomotives for pulling goods trains during night, which is very efficient, it's just not possible anymore. Or just quickly using a goods locomotive to pull a passenger train when there's a shortage of locomotives. There are a lot of organizational hurdles in between. And what ultimately happened to the railway? You know, the delays of the German Bahn have become a bit of a running joke. And people talk about the 4 arch enemies of the Deutsche Bahn: spring, summer, fall, and winter. Yeah. However, it's not as bad as some people want you to believe. My experience with the Deutsche Bahn isn't as good as it should be, but it's not as horrible as some people want you to believe. But still, there is a lot that needs to be done. But that really isn't a political thing. When the funds are not available, what are you supposed to do? Okay, I wanted to be quick about that question. Something was necessary, but not that. Thoughts on the V200 and its British relative, the Class 42. Let's start with the negative. I'm not the biggest fan of the outside appearance of the V200. But that doesn't mean I don't like it, and I certainly will create a model of it eventually. It's just not really a locomotive that stands out to me by the looks. That's why I don't have a model so far. But from a technical aspect, it is a very fascinating locomotive. And only recently, so it's a bit of a coincidence, I delved into its British as well as American relatives. Fascinating history and something that I will eventually cover. Sure, of course. What are your opinions on the ET403? Donald Duck, or Der Weiße Hai. I love that EMU. It is kind of in German railway history, one of the bigger footnotes, I would say, which is kind of sad, considering its significance. And it's a very fascinating train that also one day I hopefully will be able to model. And I guess you can place your bets if you will first see a 3D printed model of the ET403 by me, or the real one running again. Which is something that has been in the works for many years, but, you know, restoring an EMU it's a minefield and very costly, and the Deutsche Bahn unfortunately didn't have enough interest in it. So it's up to private companies, and our Heritage Railway, of course, cannot do that. They don't have the money. So it needs to be a private operator who has a concept. And I guess that is what is currently about to happen, if that's still going to happen. I'm not so familiar with the latest events, but I know that it's under restoration. On to the personal questions. And I guess the burning questions of many. Where are you from? Since your accent is quite unique. I'm from southern Germany, Bavaria. However, also when I speak German, I don't speak dialect, so it's not that my dialect influences my accent. What color shirt are you wearing? Let me check. It's beige. What is your relation to railroading? Do you know people who work at railroads, or even work there yourself? And if you have none, how did you become interested in trains? One of my grandpas worked for the Bundesbahn a long time. However, it's not really the personal connection to trains which led me to it. I guess model railways is a thing that had been present in my family, so it just happened that model railway catalogs landed in my hands of little me, and then there was a certain British TV show, and that's about it. I know this is not really a satisfying answer, but it's all I can give you. Do you play train simulators? I used to. Many, many moons ago on my Windows 97 computer. These were good times. That I even could play those games on that old potato is a miracle looking back at it. But I don't do these days. I just don't really have the time for that. I do still play train-related games, but these are more management type of games like the Train Rally series. And with that, unfortunately, I have to say no to the second question related to that. Would you consider modeling for train simulators? I personally don't have an interest in it, and it often arises a question if I could maybe put my models into simulators or adapt them. But the big issue here is because I design my models for 3D printing, are all the details you find on my models proper, physically present details. Every single rivet is physically there and has many vertices on its own. And that extends to the whole model. Of course, on the other hand, I also have certain wall thicknesses that are necessary for 3D printing that you wouldn't need for a 3D model. So basically, there is no way of adapting my models for a train simulator. I would have to recreate them mostly from scratch. But it's all time I could spend on models for my main project, so it's just unfortunately not going to happen. Oh, the next one is a fun question. Imagine working with trains. What would be your dream job in which era? They mention a few examples: traveling around as part of the crew in a guard's wagon, shoveling coal into the belly of a steam train, operating switches at a signal box, and watching trains all day. I mean, the idea is wonderful. Who wouldn't love to do any of these things? Of course, the reality looks a little bit different. Quite different, actually. I wouldn't really want to do that, but we can romanticize the idea, of course. And what would be my dream job? Probably to be the driver. And maybe not even of a prestigious passenger train, but rather of a slow goods train that makes many stops and has to do a lot of shunting, where you see many places and many odd angles, many dirty corners. That sounds lovely. I guess that would be my dream job. Yeah. Okay, my voice is very hoarse. I'm sorry about that, but I just will continue. It's too late now. Which facts from your research surprised you the most to learn? I guess there's one thing that comes to mind. And that is that modern sliding wall wagons, pretty much the modern equivalent to the traditional covered wagon, that these did in fact not evolve from covered wagons, at least not in Germany, but rather from a steel coal wagon that was covered with lids, so it could transport things like salt or lime. That was just mind-blowing. Which misconception do you find non-Germans commonly have about German railways? Well, that is a good question. I honestly can't really give you a good answer. So maybe I also will pass that one on to you. Because 80% of you are non-Germans, and you have learned probably a lot about German railways in the past about 2 years. So let me know, what misconception did you have? Do you have any Asian trains that interest you? I mean, generally everything that's narrow gauge. And I have certainly a general interest. I also have 2 books about the Japanese steam era. Unfortunately, the only thing in English about the whole book is the headline. So I can't even read a single word. So I guess I have to learn Japanese one day. But I mean, I can look at the pictures. If you have any good suggestions on English literature about Asian railways in general, or maybe specific topics, Japanese narrow gauge or the Shinkansen or whatever it is, leave your tips in the comments, because I would love to have a good reading on that. If you've been around since my Instagram time, you might know that I have modeled some sugarcane locomotives from the island of Java. But these are of course all German-built locomotives that were just modified in their livery and smaller details here and there. Have you ever considered building a miniature 5 or 7.25 inch gauge locomotive, or even an entire railway? I love the idea, and I guess I had that thought long before I did Blender. There was the idea to go all out with brass-made models at a large scale. I hadn't settled down on an exact scale, but that never went far, and these days that's just too large for me. I mean, I have my LGB railway, but otherwise, for my own modeling sake, I will stick to 1:50. Do you have a model of the BR 112.1? Unfortunately not. That is the closest I can offer. But talking about surprise questions. Will you turn your models into Shinkali on a train that transforms into a robot? Up until that point, I didn't even know Shinkalion existed. I guess I'm just not really into anime. The only anime I watched are some Studio Ghibli films, and also that was not on my own accord. But my friends who are interested in anime are not at all into trains. So I guess this overlap just hasn't been there for me to find out about Shinkalion. Unfortunately, however, that is something I don't see myself doing, as that heads way into a different direction. What interests besides trains do you have? I can now be mean and say anything that has to do with art. Before I started Blender, I did kind of a little bit of everything. I've been drawing a lot. I even made some oil paintings. I wrote poetry as well as some short stories. I did all of the things. I also have a big interest in music. I'm not really creating music my own. I'm more like a bedroom singer, if you know what I mean. But I'm excessively listening to music. So every time I'm doing something on my computer, if it's not recording audio or editing a video for obvious reasons, I'm most likely listening to music. So if you look at my models and look at how much time I've spent in Blender, all that time I spent listening to music. All kinds of music, from classic to rock to indie folk, everything. I guess if you want to hear names, Antonin Dvorak, Jim Steedman and Julian Baker. Yeah, Minecraft. I play a lot of Minecraft in my off time, I guess, but it's also, building. Who person in their right mind, who spent most of their time in Blender, would spend their spare time building in Minecraft? And that kind of leads me to the last question. What is your favorite TV show? I cannot really give you an answer to that, as for many years I haven't really been watching any TV. It just doesn't really appeal to me. However, I still will give you an answer because I have to watch something, I also don't have a streaming service or anything like that. I watch a lot of YouTube. And when it comes to multiple series, what the plural of the word? I guess that will be Hermitcraft. Or the other series is coming from the same bubble of creators like the Life series or Empires. I'm pretty sure there must be some overlap between my channel's audience and the Hermitcraft audience. I'm pretty certain there is. I mean, there had been one comment about the white buffer rings, that they look like Corrales' eyes. But there's at least one person. We made it. My voice feels like a cheese grate. It probably sounds like a cheese grate too. So I guess thank you for sticking with me. I have now recorded for over 2 hours. And there are barely any double takes. So God knows how long the final video will be. I guess you know. Hopefully it will be under an hour. I mean, you're amazing if you're a first-time viewer and made it to that point. Then either you have fallen asleep, or I just can't help you. But welcome on board. But thank you for sticking around, and in particular thank you for supporting my work, for bringing this channel to 10,000 subscribers. Let's just take a minute to think about that. Remember the last time you were afraid to speak in front of class? Even though you exactly knew that half of the 20 people were half asleep anyway? And I'm now putting out videos, talking to thousands of people, in some instances even 100,000, and I'm just shrugging my shoulders, like it's nothing. You know, I don't feel like that when I talk into the microphone in my bedroom. I rather feel like a weirdo who's talking to himself. It's weird. But because of that especially, I'm very thankful for all your kind comments you leave under all of my videos, because these show me that every tick that view number goes up is actually, I mean, there will be also some bots of course, but for the most part, that will be a real human. Or maybe an alien, I don't know who you are exactly, you know, I just assume that you're a human, maybe you're an AI, I don't know. Okay, I stop now. I stop because some idiot has to edit that down, and that idiot is me. Because that channel does not make enough revenue so that I could hire an editor. How have I not starved yet? Oh, and, and that leads me to the point that I have forgotten something very important. The reason I haven't starved yet, and now I'm going back to my serious voice, the reason I even can continue doing this work is of course all of you watching, but it is also my awesome channel members who go even beyond and support me monetarily. No one of you has to do that, of course. But if you can afford it, I know many of you simply can't, but if you can afford it and my content is valuable enough for you so that you feel like doing it, then I greatly appreciate that help. So a big thank you to all my channel members, which include in the top 2 tiers, but not limited to. On the screen you can read all the names, include Contrion, Dan, Dave Heise, Kay Frankly, Lucas Ilskens, Martin Wigiken, Michael Beck, SGT Scuba, Søren Dominic Cook, Steamy Player, and Void Elder. And I am aware that I have not answered all of your questions. Of course, many were duplicates and kinda similar. Some where I just had to cut, otherwise it would have gotten too long. And I've also excluded video suggestions, as well as technical railway questions that would require their own history episode to be answered. But all of these questions and ideas I have taken note of. So maybe one of them will eventually pop up.